The outriders charged across the white river in the early morning, their horses lashing spray, each rider in full armour, bows at the ready. From the foothills of the eastern mountains the villagers looked down in terror. The Emperor is coming, the Emperor is coming. Too fearful to shout, they whispered his name, the mighty Khan, lord of all that was. How could this be? A tiny village so far from the Emperor in his shining palace that they did not even know the name of the great city he had founded. They, and tens of thousands of such villages scattered throughout his empire, were as dust beneath his feet. The village people trembled. They did not know what to do. The riders would tell them. The warriors stormed up the paths, hooves thundering, hundreds upon hundreds of them, each soldier bred in combat, each fearless and to be feared. The villagers huddled together as the horses approached. The commander of the guard held up his hand and the riders pulled their chargers to a halt, their horses steaming and snickering. The village chief threw himself down on the ground before the great warrior. The other villagers did the same, hiding their eyes in their hands. The commander looked down at the wretched peasants. "Stand," he commanded. Slowly the poor farmers rose to their feet and looked up at the commander. "Your Emperor, master of the world, will be passing. Upon the pain of death you must stay within your huts, remain out of sight. Go, now." The terrified villagers obeyed. They ran to their homes, grabbing their children as they scurried away. They fearfully barred their doors and pulled the rush screens closed. The Emperor was not to witness so lowly a people as they. It was like this. For 3 months of every year the Emperor travelled throughout his lands. He had conquered the 5 kingdoms, his armies had slaughtered tens upon tens of thousands, but now he sought to bring a coherent and thriving culture to his realm. History would relate that he wrought great changes to society. Amongst his retinue numbered surveyors, doctors, scholars, cartographers. Establishing schools and medical facilities, instituting new agricultural practices, he created irrigation, crop rotation, arboriculture, and new farming methods. But first, and always, feared by millions, he was the greatest soldier who had ever lived. The villagers knew only that a terrible god was approaching, his authority absolute. If they disobeyed, if the Emperor's vision was sullied by witnessing any one of them, their village would be burnt to the ground. And that, should the Emperor be in any way disturbed, this could happen on a whim, on a nod, a casual wave of his hand, and they, their children, their homes and livestock would be no more. The Emperor approached. Battalions of soldiers guarded the Emperor, their armour shining in the morning sun. Thousands of them, moving slowly across the plains, a dust plume above them, earth thrown up under the wheels of the chariots. Then the special guard, the hardiest warriors, ready to die to protect their master. Great circles of paladins, champions and heroes, each dedicated to crush anything that should even slightly delay the onward march of the court. Within their iron guard the court encircled themselves. Thousands of slaves, servants to the court, concubines, eunuchs, farriers, quartermasters, cooks, provost-marshals, carpenters, ironmongers, tent-makers, many more. From the most menial servants of the 3,000 wives to the highest ambassadors and court advisers. This was a city. More than 30,000 people moving across the landscape, an awesome, unstoppable beast. A sight to make the bravest pale and run. Silk-cushioned and luxurious, carried by slave-bearers, great ornamented sedan chairs held the highest court officials. Sylvan, gleaming from horizon to horizon, and there, at the heart, the great golden chariot in which the Emperor himself was carried. There was nothing created by man that was more wonderful than the sight of the Emperor on his inspection tour of the greatest empire ever conceived. This year, the year of the horse, the Emperor had received a gift from a great warlord of the West. A black stallion. During its capture and taming it had killed 5 men. It was truly a gift fit for a king. This day the Emperor had determined to ride the stallion into the mountains himself at the head of his army. It made a glorious sight. The great ruler led his army up through the pass. His guards, their shields gleaming, their weapons rattling, followed behind their ruler, the ruler of the world. Khan, a horseman of unparalleled skill, took delight in the freshness of the day, in looking up into the mountains, free from the noise and the constraints of being constantly surrounded by his guards. He spurred his horse. He felt the great power of the beast as it found its strength and, free to run, galloped upwards along the pass. The guards, surprised, kicked their horses to catch up with the emperor, but he was far ahead of them. Khan charged towards the village on the hill. Suddenly something appeared on the path in front of him. A child, scampering from a small group of trees, ran in front of the racing war-horse. The Emperor of China, astonished, pulled at the reins and the horse came to a stamping halt. It was a little girl, a tiny tot, a scrap of a thing. He could barely see her over the head of his horse. Never before had such a thing happened. It was an outrage. Khan, although he had many sons and daughters, was not patient with children, and rarely had dealings with them, and only those of the highest royal blood. This little thing was a peasant child, ill-dressed and dirty, an impudent waif to be disposed of as one might flick dust from a robe. His guards gasped, drew their swords and charged up beside the emperor, but he held up his hand and they stopped. He turned his horse to get a clearer sight of the child, but she skeeted to the front again and said, "You can't go there." Khan looked up at the small wood from where the child had run. Amazed, he said, "And why not, child?" "Because you can't," she said. He turned the horse to the front again, and again the child scampered in front of him. "And you can't go there either." His guards could not believe it. The child's entire family would die for this effrontery. "Why?" asked the emperor. "Because that's where Mummy and Daddy live, and you can't go, and that," she pointed to the trees, "is where my flower lives." "Can I, then, go there?" asked the emperor, pointing to his left, at an impassable cliff. The little girl thought about it for a moment, and then shook her head. "And why not?" scowled the emperor, beginning to lose his temper at this incredible impudence. "Because it's too steep," she replied, practically. "So, I can't go anywhere now, can I?" he said, absolutely bemused. "You can go back," she said, and glared up at him. She was about knee-high to his horse. "Shall I, sire?" asked his chief guard, indicating his sword and looking at the child. But then the emperor, ruler of all men, started laughing. He shook his head at the guard. "Do you know who I am?" he addressed the child. She shook her head. "I am the emperor." This didn't mean anything to the little girl, and she just stood there. For the first time in his life, Khan was rendered helpless. An entire army had been brought to a halt by a 4-year-old girl. Suddenly he found himself saying to the little girl, "Will you show me your flower?" She frowned, considered, then nodded, and, turning, scampered towards the trees, followed by the King of Kings and a mighty stallion. He motioned to his guards to keep their distance. Not to be treated with total devotion was an entirely new experience for him, and he found it to be liberating. He caught up with the child. She was bending over something. He stopped the horse, dismounted, and bent over to examine whatever it was that was taking her attention. A little yellow flower was growing, and together they looked at it. "It's an orchid, a yellow orchid," he said. "It's my flower," the little girl said. "Don't hurt it." Khan knew that after his army, his court, had passed, not only would the flower have been crushed into the earth, but the trees themselves would probably be destroyed. The flower was beautiful. Surrounded by the cultivated blossoms of the great gardens of his palace in the Forbidden City, the emperor had all but ceased to notice them. But this small, wild, living thing, so vulnerable, so alive, touched him. "I will not hurt your flower, little girl," he said. She looked up at him, saw that he spoke the truth, and nodded, satisfied. "What is your name, child?" "Ming Mei," she replied. Khan stood up and got back on his horse. "Farewell, Ming Mei," he said. "I will remember you." He turned the great horse and galloped back to where his guards were waiting, appalled. It is called the March of the Orchid. Instead of taking the route into the eastern mountains, Emperor Khan led his court a further 700 miles around the mountains. The journey took months longer than planned. The winter fell upon them and they suffered great hardships. Many died of the cold. Emperor Khan was a great ruler and a man of his word. Ming Mei, a tiny peasant girl, is remembered in Chinese literature and stands equal with the highest monarch of the age before a little yellow orchid.